Joseph Toye had been born on March 14, 1919, in the coal town of Pittston, Pennsylvania, a place where life was shaped by hard work and little certainty. He was the youngest of 8 children, growing up in a crowded household where money was scarce and responsibility came early. His father had once begun life as a school teacher, but never followed that path for long. He drifted between jobs, at one point working in the post office, but he was known more for his fondness for drink than for steady work. He died in his 50s, leaving Joe's mother to raise the family through difficult years. Joe had been only around the 8th grade when his father died. The loss changed everything. There was no social security in those days, no safety net waiting for families like theirs. Survival depended on whoever in the family could bring home a paycheck. Fortunately, Joe's older brothers were already working, though as they married and left to build their own lives, the responsibility at home shifted toward the youngest son. Joe attended Ustown High School in a small coal mining borough nearby, but he lasted only a year. School felt like a luxury his family couldn't afford. He left to find work wherever he could, first in butcher shops and restaurants, doing whatever jobs a young boy could get. What he really wanted, though, was to work in the mines like the men around him. That opportunity finally came when he turned 17 and a half. The job was dangerous and exhausting, but to Joe it was honest work, and it paid better than anything else he had known. He stayed in the mines until the operation shut down. Like many young men in Pennsylvania's coal country, he had to look elsewhere for opportunity. In 1941, he traveled to Reading and joined the local police force. The job lasted only about 6 months, but for the first time he felt like he was doing something steady, something with a bit of responsibility. At that time, Joe wasn't married. Most of his siblings were, and he had remained behind to care for his mother. Because of that responsibility, he had been exempt from the draft. But everything changed on December 7, 1941. When news of Pearl Harbor spread across the country, it reached even the quiet corners of Pennsylvania coal towns. Joe knew almost immediately what he would do. His mother moved in with one of his sisters, where she would be looked after. That removed the one reason he had for staying home. The day after Pearl Harbor, Joe Toye went to Wilkes-Barre and enlisted in the United States Army. Within days, he was on a train heading south to Camp Lee in Petersburg, Virginia. The Army moved quickly in those days, and Joe soon found himself in basic training with the Medical Corps. Afterward, he was sent north to Washington, D.C., where he joined the 29th Infantry Division, the Blue and Gray. His duties were a mix of medic work and truck driving, and for several months his life settled into a routine of military discipline. But Washington bored him. Much of the unit's time was spent on guard duty around government buildings and airfields. Bands played in the mornings. Ceremonies and parade drills filled the days. To Joe, it felt more like showmanship than soldiering. He had joined the Army expecting action, not pageantry. Then one day, a notice appeared, asking for volunteers for the parachute troops. The idea immediately caught his attention. For Joe, the appeal was simple. Joining the paratroopers would get him out of Washington. There was also the extra $50 a month in jump pay, a sum that seemed enormous to a young man who had grown up counting every dollar, and, like most 21-year-olds, he felt the pull of adventure. He signed up. After passing the physical, he was sent south to Camp Toye, Georgia, sometime around the summer of 1942. The camp sat in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, and it was where the Army was forming new parachute units from scratch. One of those units was the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. When Joe arrived, he was placed into a company filled mostly with strangers. Many of them were just out of high school, 18 or 19 years old, and brand new to the Army. Joe, at 21, already felt like a veteran by comparison, even though he had only been in uniform a few months longer than they had. Before long, he was assigned to Easy Company. That was where he first encountered the company commander, Herbert Sobel. Joe never cared much for him. Sobel was strict to the point of obsession and had a habit of inventing inspections or exercises at the worst possible moments. Soldiers might be dressed and ready to go into town on a rare Saturday afternoon pass, when Sobel would suddenly call them back for another inspection. To Joe, it seemed unnecessary, something no other officer bothered to do. Still, training continued relentlessly. Because of his background in the coal mines, Joe was assigned to demolition work. In the mines, he had learned to handle dynamite, though the Army preferred TNT. During training exercises, his team would move ahead of the rest of the unit and create obstacles, Blowing trees across roads or setting up simulated demolitions meant to challenge the advancing troops. One night during an exercise, Joe and another soldier named Warren Skip Muck were posted to an outpost. One of them was supposed to stay awake while the other rested. Somehow both men drifted off to sleep. When the officers came around for inspection, they found them. The next day, Captain Sobel called the two soldiers into his office. He gave them a choice: face a court-martial or accept company punishment. The unit was about to begin a long march toward Atlanta, and neither Joe nor Skip saw any reason to risk a court-martial. They accepted the punishment. The following day, they were sent to scrub every stove in the kitchen. After that, they marched behind trucks along a stretch of road where soldiers had thrown their empty cans during training. Their job was to pick up every piece of trash they could find. Only when the road was clean were they allowed to return. But the punishment didn't end there. As Easy Company began its march toward Atlanta, Joe and Skip were assigned extra duties. They had to gather wood, build fires, and carry water for the rest of the men. While the others slept, Joe searched the dark countryside for firewood. He barely slept at all that first night and felt the exhaustion the next day pressing into his bones. Still, quitting was never an option. At Camp Toye, men either pushed through the training or washed out of the program entirely. Joe was determined to make it. Eventually, the company reached Atlanta and boarded a train bound for Fort Benning, where they would begin jump training. Joe fell asleep almost instantly once he was seated. Somewhere along the ride, he felt a hand slap his shoulder. It was Sobel. Joe had assumed the punishment was finished, but Sobel told him and Skip to report to his office again when they arrived at Fort Benning. The discipline dragged on for weeks longer than Joe thought reasonable. In his mind, there should have been a point where the officers simply let it go. Despite that, Joe continued through the training without serious trouble. The physical demands didn't bother him much. Years in the coal mines had hardened his body, and army life had already taught him the basics of military routine. The endless runs up Currahee Mountain were exhausting, but they were simply another challenge to overcome. Jump training at Fort Benning brought its own moments of tension. The towering parachute structures looked intimidating the first time a man stood beneath them. Joe probably felt the same nerves as everyone else, but he never hesitated. When his turn came, he simply jumped. One instructor had to remind him afterward that there was a proper way to exit the platform. But Joe had already done it his own way, excited and eager, not worrying much about technique. For him, the greatest reward came when the training was complete. Wearing the boots and the parachute wings of a paratrooper filled him with pride. The extra $50 in pay didn't hurt either. Much of it he sent home to his mother. By the time the regiment shipped overseas, Joe Toye had become part of a tight brotherhood within Easy Company. England was unlike anything he had known before. Coming from a small coal town in Pennsylvania, the customs of British life seemed strange at first. Shops kept different hours, pubs operated differently, and rationing shaped everyday life. But Joe quickly grew fond of the people. While stationed near Swindon, he met a young woman who worked at a bank. She had come from Birmingham and was boarding with a local family. She and Joe began spending time together, mostly as friends, and eventually the family invited him over for dinner. Joe hesitated at first. Food rationing was strict in Britain, and he knew that anything they served him would mean less for them, but the family insisted, welcoming him into their home despite the shortages. When he finally agreed, he ate only small portions out of respect. The head of the household had been a veteran of the First World War. In combat, he had lost a leg. Joe listened to his stories but never truly imagined that such a fate could happen to him. War still seemed distant, something looming somewhere across the channel rather than something that might mark his own body. From the PX, Joe managed to bring the man small gifts: talcum powder for the stump of his missing leg, something that eased the irritation caused by the prosthetic. Whenever he had leave, Joe sometimes traveled to London with the other soldiers. At 22 years old, the great city felt alive in a way that was impossible to describe fully. For a young paratrooper who had grown up in the coal towns of Pennsylvania, the experience was unforgettable. None of them knew then what lay ahead. Normandy, Holland, the frozen forests of Bastogne. For the moment, Joe Toye was simply a young man far from home, proud of his boots, proud of his wings, and certain that whatever came next he would face it alongside the men of Easy Company